Archaeology of an archaeology of goddess figures and narratives as they have appeared through texts of the ages. And the book is also wonderfully engaging and exploring a pantheon of pop culture figures from film, television, literature, and folklore through this critical lens. So if Mary is ready, I will turn it over to you. Let's welcome Mary Magoulick.
All right, thanks Julie, and thanks everyone for showing up, both in the room and online. We appreciate it. We are recording this, and the computer setup here is a little confusing because I don't have any monitor except the screen, so it's really kind of hard. So I have some friends who are going to help me click things when they need to be clicked. If I can't see them, thanks for bearing with us. We're starting a little late. So right here on this first screen, we have two images of so-called goddesses right at the outset. And I'm just curious if any of you recognize either of them. So if you recognize the figurine to the left, raise your hand. Handful of people in the room, probably a bunch of people online. What about the one to the right? One person, okay, at least in the room. So go ahead, somebody name the figurine to the left. Louder.
Venus of Willendorf.
Venus of Willendorf, very good. How about the one to the right?
Is that a Lilith figure? Or Corey? Very similar.
It's from Mycenaean culture, and it's typically called a snake goddess. Not Mycenaean, sorry, Minoan culture from Crete, from the island of Crete, which is now part of Greece. Both of these are going to figure in some of the examples I play of pop culture versions of goddesses, and I asked other people to name them because the very fact that we call them Venus, a goddess, is already an imposition of our perspective and our point of view. We don't actually know whether these figurines or any of the women represented, particularly from the Paleolithic period, were goddesses or would have been considered goddesses in their day. All right, let's go to the next. This is the table of contents for my book, and so you can see in part one, I do kind of go over some of this prehistory, looking at some of the ancient figurines, but also looking at some aspects of goddess culture, and then also giving introductions to mythology, so how you study myth, and how mythological perspectives can be helpful in this kind of work. And then I also give an introduction to feminism and how feminism can be applied in this work. And then you can see in part two is where I have all of the examples that I look at. And today, I'm mostly going to talk about the ones that are in the sort of gold color here, so the bad goddesses from television and film. And then I'll briefly, if there's time, talk about some of the good goddesses. So there's other stuff going on in the book as well. I decided to speak freely today because I thought it would be easier for people to follow. If you want the more polished, articulate version, you can read the book. All right, next. So just a little bit about goddess culture itself. It is considered the fastest growing religion today, at least by some estimates, particularly in places like are listed there, which is developed parts of the world, and it goes by a variety of names. This book is not, and I don't claim to be an expert in what goddess culture is, this book is not like an ethnography of any one or even several goddess culture traditions, because the main point of the book is really to investigate the pop culture and literary versions of these. But I do give a little bit just to help orient people to what I'm talking about. So people who are believers in goddess culture tend to think that prehistory was dominated by goddesses, and particularly a great goddess or mother goddess, and possibly was also matriarchal, so women ruled. This prehistoric period is assumed to be, at least by contemporary believers in the goddess myth, it's presumed to be a superior time, ethically, almost utopian in some descriptions of it. And it is thought to be a way that could point to a better future for women and all humanity and the planet as well. All right, let's go to the next slide. Part of why this religion grew, I argue, is because of Maria Gaboutas, who was I believe, a Lithuanian scholar, trained there and then in Germany, and then she came to the US and worked at both Harvard and UCLA. She led a number of digs in the Mediterranean, and she was trained in a 19th century, an early 20th century perspective on this idea of prehistory dominated by goddesses and matriarchy, which in its inception was not seen as a positive thing. So the Victorian men who first imagined this theory did not see this previous matriarchal goddess period as superior. To the contrary, they saw it as inferior. And they thought it was a great triumph that patriarchy eventually came along and sort of fixed culture. But Gaboutas, who really starts publishing around maybe the 50s, embraces it. She was trained in it, and she gives it the spin of having been very, very positive. Even though there were people questioning this by that point, she was sort of old school. And so she influenced a lot of feminists, particularly during that second wave of feminism. By like the 70s, you start getting a lot of other books by other people, assuming that this is reality. Here's this authoritative, university professor making these arguments. And so I call her sort of the mother goddess of the goddess culture. All right, let's go to the next one. She influenced people like Starhawk too, who was on that previous slide. So what's wrong with any of this? Well, as Mary Lefkowitz says, along with a lot of other scholars, as I say, from pretty early on in the 20th century, people were questioning this. She says they're not rendering ancient models faithfully, and in their reconstruction of the past, they're simplifying women, demoting them to creatures of mere sexuality, which she says surely harms women, and some of the qualities that share with the rest of humanity then go unexplored and unacknowledged. All right, next. These are a couple books I do recommend if you are interested in reading what more recent feminist archaeologists. The book to the left, I think, includes something like, I don't know, a dozen or so feminist archaeologists who each go into depth in one part of the world where these ideas of goddess culture supposedly show evidence. And they give a very, in my opinion, fascinating portrait, but it's very, very different from goddess culture's portrait of prehistory. It's not as simple. It's more complex, and it's not as definitive, right? They can't say too much about, they can say actually a lot about prehistory, but not what people believed and not what their myths and stories and gods were like. So, and then Cynthia Eller does an excellent job of looking at all of this kind of evidence in history, similar to what I do in the first two chapters as well. So I highly recommend both of these. All right, next. Yeah, maybe you can do arrow up. All right, so there's scientific skepticism connected to, oops, I think we have stopped sharing the screen there. So if you go to share screen, and maybe you need to click on slideshow, and then current slide. All right, so some other reason for skepticism is that, yeah, as I said, we just don't know what our ancestors could specifically have believed. We can glean little about those kinds of cultural details, like beliefs and stories and so on, especially from the Paleolithic period. So there could have been matriarchal moments, there could have been widespread matriarchal cultures, there could have been goddess worship, but we can't prove it. It's unprovable, and there's simply no definitive evidence that contemporary archaeologists and prehistorians accept as evidence of this. All right, next. I included just a few images of some things called goddess. I think you have to go back one. Thank you. And on this slide, you can see the Venus of Lucelle, so-called, and one from Galgenberg. The reason I put these two against each other is to show you that we have this idea that all the goddesses in the ancient past look like the one to the left, right? That's Diatopagus, I think is the word. Fleshy hips and thighs and bellies and stuff. So she looks like maybe she's pregnant, one hand is on her belly. Her little horn that she's holding has 13 notches in it. Interesting thing about this one, it was not the only figurine at this site. It was a part of a limestone block, or it was a limestone block that fell from the ceiling of the shelter, which happens with limestone, right? Over thousands of years, water gets in, it freezes, etc. Blocks fall. There were at least four other decorated blocks in this same shelter. One of which had a male, apparently hunter. Several others had other images of women. So the idea of this being a unitary goddess, which is often the idea proposed by goddess culture, is already questionable if you just look at the tiniest bit of context. And then I put in some other sort of, thinner, like this supposedly dancing woman to the right, to show that there wasn't a single body type represented in prehistory. All right, next. And then there are some more figurines. The one to the right is the first one that was actually called Venus, and it was one of the first representations of a human being found at the Logerie, I think. In the Vézère Valley in France, which was first called Venus because if you look at the actual Venus down there in the inset image, that is the Venus pudica, which is the modest Venus because she's covering her genitals with her hands, right? So this Venus was seen as being the immodest Venus because it's all just kind of on display. And the idea that we would impose our terms and our concepts of modesty, I hope you can see, is already a little bit problematic in the science of archaeology. But, this was done in the mid-19th century. Things were different. But they have stuck in our culture. All right, next. These are some other ones called Venuses, at least the three to the right. And, I just let you use your own imagination for whether those are even definitively female. And the one to the very right, I think, is a man. And it's just to show you that there were also images of men. I believe one of the scholars in that Ancient Goddesses volume said that no more than 50% of all of the images of humans from prehistory can be definitively determined to be women. No more than 50%. So let's go to the next. And then I did put in a couple of images of actual mother goddesses from known historical cultures where we know definitively that these were patriarchies. So to point out that even if they were goddesses, it doesn't necessarily mean that these were women-centered or matriarchal cultures. Right, next. And again, all of these ideas came from male founders like Bakofen, whose book is in the upper right, or James Fraser, Sir James George Fraser. And then the poet Keats had a big role to play as well with his poem Endymion, all in the 19th century. And again, these were all men who thought of this prehistory as predominantly inferior. All right, next. All right, so let's get to some examples of the bad goddess. And the first one, this is the list of all the ones I look at in that chapter. The bad goddess is this is the goddess who is, like you see Kate Blanchett here, who plays Hela in Thor Ragnarok. You know, she's in very dark makeup, clothing, you know, her hair is a little chaotic looking, and she is a figure of evil and chaos and on the dark side. So let's go on. And then I'm not going to talk really about Lilith today, except to show you this picture, but she's the progenitor of all the vampires in True Blood, and she's a pretty bad figure in the final season of that HBO series as well. The way our culture tends to, we remarkably have a lot of goddesses in our film and television and literature, but they tend to show up as either vilified or romanticized. Vilified primarily by people in the film and television industry, romanticized primarily in fiction by women, particularly slightly older fiction by women. So let's go on to the next page. All right, so Hela is introduced as a daughter of Odin here, who is worse than her brothers. She immediately, I'm going to show you a clip from this, hopefully it will play. And she immediately emasculates Thor by, you know, crushing his hammer. And she's, you know, in pursuit of limitless power, she tells them to kneel. All right, so let's go to the next one and play. We're going to start playing.
So he's gone. It's a shame. I would have liked to have seen that.
You must be Hela. I'm Thor, son of Odin.
Really? You don't look like him.
Perhaps we can come to an arrangement.
You sound like him. Neil.
Beg your pardon.
Neil. Before you're queen.
I don't think so. It's not possible.
Darling, you have no idea what's possible.
All right, so here's Hollywood's view of a goddess, right? She's from the dark side, as I said, angry, brutal, powerful, feeds on havoc or chaos throughout the film, not just that there's more, of course, from that scene. I already talked about her makeup. Even her humor is dark, and, you know, she's worse than Loki. So, you know, a castrating, angry woman who feeds off chaos. All right, that's one version, at least, of a Hollywood goddess. As Thor sums up at one point, I was going to show you this scene, but there's not time. You're just the worst. It can't be you leading us, Thor says. All right, next. Actual Norse mythology portrays these characters a little bit differently. Hel is the figure connected with the underworld, like our word Hel. She's usually called Hel in the older sources. But she really only figures in one story, and she was considered perhaps more of a late literary personification of the grave than a being that was much of a goddess in her own right. But of course, we can do whatever we want, right? With culture, it's going to make money in Hollywood. And the Marvel comic universe really wanted a big bad woman. Here's a vehicle for a fine actress. So that's why we get Hela. All right, let's go to the next one. And Odin and Thor are also quite different from Norse myth. In fact, Hela is generally conceived of as the daughter of Loki, not Odin. And Odin, you can see in the pink there, this was really not considered, you know, good the way he is in these films. And it's not uncommon for superhero films and comics generally to make their superhero very Christ-like. So a lot of people have written about this. And, you know, here we have Sir Anthony Hopkins playing Odin. I mean, kind of looks godlike, right? Old man with a beard, distinguished looking, British accent. At least how a lot of people conceive of God. All right, let's go on to the next one. I think our next example is, okay, this is The 13th Warrior, which is a film based on a novel by Michael Crichton that's loosely based on Beowulf. And here the Grendel, which is the monster in Beowulf, are called the Wendels. And the Wendels are basically cannibals. They are a tribe of prehistoric humans who have somehow managed to survive, live among and plague the Norsemen, and they basically are awful also. So notice in this next scene, I'm going to show how the goddess representative, the mother Wendell, deep in the cave, right? So these are cavemen. So she's deep in this cave. She has blood-stained skin, dark-ringed eyes, long dreadlocks decorated with seashells, and she prepares a poison. She's going to dip her claw in some poison as a snake, a large snake, slithers over her chest and under her arms. And remember that snake goddess figurine, which also had a snake wound around its body, cinched in waist, big thing on her head. All right, so let's go to that scene. And as it loads here, yeah.
I'll make sure you speak into the mic when you have trouble with hearing.
All right, you know what, I'm gonna go ahead and take it. This is Magoulick, which is the Beowulf figure in the film. Hearing here she is. Poison. Hero, page hero, So, although he kills her, obviously, she also killed him because she managed to scratch him with her poison claw. So Paleolithic culture shows no evidence, according to most experts, of people eating human flesh. So that's a problematic contention already. And of course, this is very different from the goddess culture version of this goddess-dominated matriarchal prehistory, right? In fact, some experts believe that Upper Paleolithic people probably had fairly peaceful lives. But again, we feel like we can appropriate even these completely imagined pasts in any way that's going to sell movies in our culture. All right, so next. This is, and let's just go to the next again. This is, okay, Wicker Man. How many of you have seen either version of Wicker Man? A few people. So the 1973 version is a superior film if you're looking to watch one of these. But we're actually going to look at the 2006 version today because it's the one that plays up the mother goddess culture more. And in both cases, there's a policeman who goes to an island. I think in the 73 version, it's off the coast of Scotland, and in the 2006 version, it's off the coast of Washington State. And he finds there, he's looking for a missing person. In the 2006 version, he actually has a relationship. You're going to see a scene where he gazes at this woman and she's the woman he had a relationship with in the real world, and possibly they had a daughter, who's the daughter he's kind of looking for throughout the film. And so they're policemen, right? These sort of patriarchal authority figures, and they find these pagans who are cultish and, again, pretty deadly. All right, so let's go play a little clip from that. Thanks, Stephanie. That's good. So let me just tell you, this will be patriarch. You can push play and then X out that. Okay. This is patriarchy's response, perhaps, to matriarchy in Hollywood.
God!
Now he's going to dress up so he can pretend he's one of them. A horrible ritual. That's his former girlfriend.
What is it? What's wrong, sister?
Don't be frightened. Go. My name is Edward. You bitches! You bitches! This is murder! Murder! You'll all be guilty! And you're doing it for nothing! Killing me won't bring back your goddamn honey! Ah! What?
So there is a cult following for this film because of
What is that? What is that? What is it? Oh, no, not the beast! Not the beast! Ah! Open my eyes! My eyes! Ah! Ah! The drone must die!
I tell him we're playing, they're not All right, so again, matriarchal goddess worshiping cultures are not seen positively. And I'll just point out that Malice is the name of that character in the 2006 version, who, you know, I argue in the book, it's kind of like bad phallus, right? Malice. And that's kind of how I guess goddess worshiping women seem from a patriarchal perspective. This screaming of you bitches, right? Kind of sums it all up. All right, one more example. Let's go to the next screen. This is going to be very short. It's from this film, Hellboy, The Golden Army. And let me just set it up briefly that it's a very minor part of the film, but there's a giant Venus of Willendorf. Remember the Venus of Willendorf, which is 5 inches approximately, the actual statuette figurine. And in this film, it's giant, even more giant than Hellboy himself, who's a giant. So, and just notice how it's shot from like below, so that you see these pendulous breasts and belly and stuff that are become monstrous. And it's just a cute little kind of whimsical moment, but let's look at it briefly.
Sorry, lady.
You should be running.
All right, so in that case, you know, again, it's not like a major part of the film, but it is this one little moment that is kind of fun, maybe, but it shows how. I mean, there were no figurines that big in the Paleolithic era, and she, you know, at the end, she's all covered with blood and stuff, so she's a force of chaos and death as well. All right, next. The actual one you can see in the upper left there. All right, just very briefly, we're not going to see any scenes from this, but if you're familiar with the Buffyverse, Buffy the Vampire Slayer is a great hero in this mainly 90s television show. And in season 5, she comes across perhaps her worst, or one of her worst foes, who ends up killing her. Sorry, spoiler alert, if you haven't seen Buffy. She does get resurrected by her friends, but this is the goddess, well, she's called a god in the series Glory, who's also known as the Beast, and yeah, she's pretty powerful. But all of these Whedon goddesses are a little bit ambiguous, but anyway, mainly, of course, for evil. Next is also in the spin-off Angel by Joss Whedon. There are only really two main women in the cast, and one of them dies giving birth to this sort of goddess figure, Jasmine, who you can see in the upper right image, Gina Torres, right, this beautiful actress, is mother goddess of everybody's dreams. But she really has this hideous maggot face, and is known as the Devourer because she eats people. All right, and then she takes the life of Cordelia in being born. And Cordelia is never in the show again. There's a whole thing online you can look at for how she's Charisma Carpenter, who played her, has criticized Joss Whedon, and as have many others, as a matter of fact. All right, next. And then the final one in the cast, Fred, is taken over by another goddess figure, Illyria, who, you know, is again kind of an ambiguous figure, but anyway, mostly these are negative. Next. Just very briefly, a few of the more positive goddesses. We have, in the Good Goddesses chapter, I look at Marion Zimmer Bradley's Avalon, which is both a phenomenally best-selling novel, even though it's like 1,000 pages, and a film. And it's romanticized view of the goddess. So it reimagines the Arthurian legend from the point of view of Morgaine, or usually known as Morgan Le Fay, much more sympathetic to her, and she's a representative of goddess culture in its, you know, as it's in its final sort of decline in Europe. But at the end of the book, there's a hopeful message that don't worry, you can reclaim goddess culture, and she was very much part of neo-pagan groups and so on. All right, next. The other series I look at is Jean Auel's Planet Caper, which is set in this Paleolithic period, in the part of France where some of those figurines were found. And it features a woman who is raised by Neanderthals, but she comes to live in Cro-Magnon culture. She herself is Cro-Magnon. So let's go to the next one, and you can see one of the kinds of poems that runs through the last few books where the goddess myth is very much developed. Next one. And this is some fan art that shows. So she actually starts out way in the east here in perhaps what is now the Ukraine as a young girl, but she meets her mate there, John Delar, and they travel all the way back to where it says Zelandoni. And these are all of the goddess figurines, the evidence of goddess culture that they encounter during their travels. Next. All right, so there's a longer chart focusing on all of the works that I look at in the final chapter of the book, but I just want to point out that in Hollywood, they're always vilified. So you see the second column there, all of the red, all of the goddesses are vilified. In novels, particularly fantasy type novels by women, speculative fiction, particularly from, you know, women who were inspired by the second wave of feminism, they tend to be romanticized. Although in all of them, women suffer, and often everybody in the show suffers for the book. All right, next. I do look into the study of myth more, and particularly some of the dualities that show up in this. And often women end up being predominantly considered emotional, whether those emotions are good or bad, like either motherly or sexual,
over there.
Hi.
or something.
Is it upstairs?
Please make yourself if you're on Zoom. Thank you. So, all right, next. Versus men, of course, on the right side, who are much more rational and scientific. And less natural, interestingly enough. It's a weird argument, but that is frequently an argument all the way from the beginning of matriarchal theory until now, that somehow women have better ties to nature because they are more natural beings. As though that makes any sense scientifically. So some of the problems with this were way back in 1973, very clearly stated by people like Sherry B. Ortner and Joan Bamberger, that whether she is being utterly exalted, in the terms that Bamberger uses, or utterly debased, toward the end of that quote, the way women get portrayed is limiting. They're the quintessential other, still the same stuff that Simone de Beauvoir was talking about way back in like, what, 1940-ish. And it's still going on right now in Hollywood. So it doesn't leave space for women to just be human beings with a full range of potential. Next. You see some of the typical kinds of assumptions behind the origins of the theory and also the way the theory continues to be perpetuated in our culture today. There's an essentializing appeal to universals that most feminist scholars today consider problematic, including all of those feminist archaeologists who wrote in that Ancient Goddesses volume that I pointed out, and Cynthia Eller's book, The Myth of Matriarchal Prehistory. If women have to be fitting these extremes of either perfect, of course, which is impossible, or perfectly deadly, which is also mostly impossible, it leaves no space for women to just be who they are. All right, next. And I'm almost done here. Sorry if I'm going a little long. I just want to point out, this is back to the table of contents, and if you look toward the bottom, the pink versions are some of the novels I look at that were written more recently, and often by BIPOC writers. Also, chapter 3 has some BIPOC writers, and those I think are chapter 3, none of those actually have goddesses in them per se, but there's like a belief that goddess culture can help the people. And I think the goddesses that get portrayed in chapter 6 are far more interesting and complex. They move away from this absolute, dualistic way of seeing them in a binary oppositional pattern of either perfect or horrible. Next. So just to sum up some of the key points from the conclusion, you can look more at the purple stuff here maybe. So Mary Daly, who's a feminist theologian, philosopher, said at one point, because she realized that there was a lot of scientific skepticism about the whole mother goddess prehistory theory. She said, well, if feminine images of the divine cannot be found in the past, then women should invent them. And I kind of argue that we have, right? And they're art, so they're interpretable. Like any art would be interpretable. And I think for the most part, they are remarkably unfeminist. Again, the idea that women are more natural is nonsense. We're all human beings we're all creatures of nature of this planet. So there's not a possibility that I think any scientist could conceive of how one human being could be more natural than another. And if these are a solution to patriarchy and people have been believing in it and sort of reproducing versions of it to inspire people for at least 50, maybe 120 or more years, we still have an awful lot of the same problems that I would say are maybe even getting worse. Problems of the environment, problems of relations between the genders, problems with class and race, and so on. And these sort of messages that I suggest at the bottom, I think might be things that a lot of people maybe subconsciously take away, that who would ever want to be any of these women, and also that our society at large seems very angry at even the idea, the possibility of powerful women, particularly in the more popular genres like film and television that everybody has access to, whereas the fantasy fiction, the speculative fiction by women is probably just going to be women readers who probably already kind of accept most of that stuff. All right, next. And this will be the last slide. So I do think these are are troublingly sexist. Most versions of this myth, again, the chapter 6 stuff, and Kate Jemison is a writer I really, really recommend, along with the others in there, Tomi Adeyemi and Madeline Miller, and Leslie Marvin Zilko and Alice Walker. There's a lot of problems in the way women get portrayed in these stories, and it keeps us at the margins of anything, like any kind of power. It represents an idea that, as many myths do, it offers a message that we should be okay with the status quo, because other things might be scarier. And our status quo is still, as I said, a pretty patriarchal one where women are not really given access to a lot of power in our world, in any area of our world. And when they are, they're often very heavily criticized and disliked by many. So the overall point I end with is that the goddess myth most often fulfills its role appropriately. And I do go much more into how myth works in several of the chapters, including the conclusion, but it does work well as a myth of our culture and of our times. So thank you, everyone, and maybe we have time for questions. So any questions in the room or online? I don't know if you can see the chat. Thanks. Anna, and then Amber, sorry.
Have you seen Yellow Jacket on Showtime yet?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, so for people online, somebody in the audience asked if I'd seen the show Yellow Jackets, which what is Showtime, I want to say. I have seen most of it. I haven't quite finished it yet, but I see that it's going somewhere that could fit into the study. Do you want to say anything about it?
No, let's just talk later.
Okay. Amber?
What was one of the most fascinating revelations for you as you were working on and writing this book?
So Amber asks, what's one of the most fascinating revelations that occurred to me as I was working on this? Well, perhaps I can tell you a little story about how I got started on this that will maybe answer that. So I just happened to be traveling in France in 2001. And I happened to decide to go down to southwestern France, where Lascaux and these other famous sites of Paleolithic art are. And it really, really captivated me. I still love it there, and I'm still working on an ongoing research project there on the tourism of prehistory. But it really got me thinking about these ideas of goddesses. And also shortly thereafter, while I was actively doing the research, I had started around 2002 on it. That novel, The Da Vinci Code, came out, right, by Dan Brown, which I do talk about a little bit in chapter 1 as well. And it completely accepts this idea of a prehistory dominated by goddesses, from this Harvard academic and stuff. And then also Cynthia Eller's book came out right around that same time called The Myth of Matriarchal Prehistory. And I read that, and it just, all of that stuff really was, I just found it very exciting. And I thought, oh, this is a project I want to work on for a really long time. So just the idea of that our idea of goddesses, I mean, it's not a hard thing to figure out, right? A lot of people work on appropriation in literature and popular culture, but to me, this was one that, there was this unifying theme that made it really interesting. Any other questions? Yes.
Hi. My question is, you talk a lot about these goddesses that are vilified. Is it not possible to have this strong female as a villain, but also be powerful? Can she not be both? In popular media, we are dominated with this male especially if we talk about Greek mythology, you have Apollo, Zeus, who are portrayed as these evil men. Is it not possible to have a vilified female goddess while also showing her strength as a female?
I see. So the question is it possible to have a strong female goddess or a powerful, destructive female goddess, which is also showing her strength, which I think you were making the point that it's similar to the male gods as well, right? That they're often pretty destructive and chaotic as well. Is that fair? Yes, yes. And, you know, a bottom line to that kind of idea is that all story is about trouble, right? It's not really going to be a very good story if there's not some thorny problem that the hero has to try to overcome. All literature, almost all literature, when it's considered good literature, is got a lot of big problems in the narrative. And so, yeah, I think that's a fair point. I just think it's perhaps done maybe a little more gleefully for the women. Like I said, like Hela is worse than Loki. I mean, Loki's a problematic character, right? But nobody in that franchise is as bad as Hela so far. So far as I know, I have to say I'm not like a huge expert on this Thor films. So did that sort of answer some of the question? I think you're right that there is a complexity to it. Dana, did you have a question? Anybody else? Anybody online?
Congratulations from online.
Thanks everyone. And is the bookstore here? I think the bookstore was supposed to be here selling some books and I don't see them anywhere, but there are refreshments back there. So if anybody wants to have some lemonade and brownies and cookies and water, we can maybe have some more informal conversations in the room, unless there's any other big questions. All right, then, thanks for coming, everyone. Thank you so much.